The boatmen of Venice will take you almost anywhere in the lagoon. Ask them for a ride to Poveglia, and most will simply shake their heads and refuse. For decades, local fishermen claimed their nets came up carrying human bone fragments instead of fish. Even today, official tours rarely land there, and for over 40 years the island sat abandoned, sealed off, its buildings crumbling under Italian sun and salt wind, visited only by trespassers brave enough to ignore the warnings. Somewhere beneath the soil of this small island in the Venetian lagoon lie the remains of tens of thousands of human beings, victims of disease, war, and isolation, layered into the earth across nearly 7 centuries. This is the story of Poveglia, an island so steeped in death that soil samples reportedly show human ash mixed into the ground itself, and to understand why it became one of the most feared places in Italian history, we have to go back to a time long before plague, before quarantine hospitals, before the very idea of Venice as we know it existed. Poveglia sits in the Venetian lagoon, between Venice and Lido, at the point where the lagoon opens toward the Adriatic Sea. It is small, low, and flat, surrounded by shallow channels that made it strategically valuable for controlling maritime traffic entering the city. Archaeological and historical records indicate that the island was inhabited as early as the 9th century, when residents from the Italian mainland fled invasions and settled across the lagoon islands, establishing small fishing communities. By the year 1379, Poveglia had grown into a modest settlement, and its location made it militarily significant during the War of Chioggia, a brutal conflict between Venice and Genoa for control of Adriatic trade routes. Venetian forces used Poveglia as a defensive outpost, and the island's proximity to the city made it a place worth holding, worth building on, worth living on. But peace did not last, and neither did ordinary life on the island. As Venice grew into one of the most powerful maritime republics in the world, it also became a magnet for something far more dangerous than enemy fleets: disease. The Black Death arrived in Europe in the mid-1300s, and Venice, as a hub of Mediterranean trade, was catastrophically exposed. Ships came from Constantinople, from Cyprus, from ports across the eastern Mediterranean, and with them came fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. Venetian authorities, watching their population collapse in successive waves of infection, made a decision that would change medical history and seal Poveglia's fate forever. In 1348, and repeatedly over the following centuries, Venice began the practice of isolating ships and individuals suspected of carrying plague before allowing them into the city. Records show the Venetian Republic required incoming vessels to wait offshore for a set period before docking, a practice from which the modern word quarantine is derived, taken from the Venetian term for 40 days, 40 giorni. This system evolved over time, and eventually the Venetian government designated smaller lagoon islands as isolation stations, known as lazarettos, where the sick and the merely suspected could be held apart from the healthy population of the city. Now, think about what that meant for the people sent there. Imagine boarding a boat, not knowing whether you were sick or simply near someone who was, and watching Venice, with its palaces and canals and bells, shrink behind you as you were rowed toward a low, flat island where you might die among strangers. This was the reality for an enormous number of Venetians and travelers over the following centuries, and Poveglia became one of the primary sites for this grim system, particularly during the most severe outbreaks. If you find this kind of layered, documented history compelling, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, so consider subscribing before we go further, because what happened on this island only grows more intense from here. Historical estimates suggest that during major plague outbreaks, particularly the devastating epidemic of 1576, which killed the painter Titian among tens of thousands of others, and the outbreak of 1630 that killed roughly a third of Venice's population, the Lazaretto Islands processed staggering numbers of the sick and dying. Poveglia specifically has long been associated with mass burial, and while exact figures are difficult to verify with precision due to the chaos of plague-era record-keeping, historians and archaeologists generally agree that the island absorbed thousands upon thousands of bodies over the centuries. It functioned as an isolation site. Soil surveys conducted in more recent academic studies have found unusually high concentrations of organic material consistent with mass burial practices, supporting the long-held belief that much of the island's ground is, quite literally, composed of human remains. This is where documented history and local legend begin to intertwine, and it's important to separate the two carefully. It is historically verified that Poveglia was used for plague quarantine and burial. It is also true that Venetian authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer number of dead during peak outbreaks, resorted to mass cremation on some of the lagoon islands to prevent further spread of disease, a documented public health practice used across plague-stricken Europe, not unique to Poveglia, but strongly associated with it in popular memory. What is less verifiable, and enters the territory of legend rather than confirmed historical record, are the more elaborate claims that patients were burned alive rather than after death, or that specific horrific rituals took place on the island's shores. These stories emerged and spread primarily through oral tradition, and later through sensationalized retellings, and while they may contain kernels of exaggerated truth reflecting the genuine horror of plague-era medicine, historians caution against accepting them as documented fact. What we do know from Venetian archival records is that the psychological terror associated with Poveglia was not invented by later storytellers. It existed in the minds of Venetians while the island was still actively used. Being sent to a lazaretto was, for much of the population, understood as a likely death sentence. The fear was rational, immediate, and rooted in direct experience, not superstition. Families watched loved ones taken away by boat, often never to return, and the island became fixed in the Venetian imagination as a place synonymous with suffering and death long before any ghost stories attached themselves to it. For a period after the worst of the plague outbreaks subsided, Poveglia's population dwindled, and the island drifted into a quieter chapter of its history, used intermittently for agriculture and modest habitation by families who apparently were untroubled by, or perhaps had simply grown accustomed to, its grim past. But the story of Poveglia does not end with plague. In fact, the island's most infamous chapter was still to come, and it involves not medieval doctors in beaked masks, but a 20th century medical institution whose history is, in some ways, even more disturbing, precisely because it is so much better documented. In 1922, Italian authorities converted Poveglia into a psychiatric hospital. This was not an isolated decision, but part of a broader European trend in the early 20th century, when many nations, including Italy, expanded institutional care for mental illness, often on isolated islands or remote sites, partly for practical reasons of space and partly reflecting prevailing attitudes that separated the mentally ill from mainstream society. The hospital operated on Poveglia for decades, treating patients suffering from a range of psychiatric conditions, and it remained functional until 1968, when it was permanently closed. This is the period from which the island's most persistent modern legends emerge, and here, more than anywhere else in Poveglia's story, we must be extremely careful to distinguish between what can be verified and what has been amplified by decades of ghost hunting television programs and internet folklore. The most widely repeated story claims that a doctor at the asylum performed crude lobotomies and other experimental torturous procedures on patients, and that he ultimately either fell, jumped, or was pushed from the hospital's bell tower under mysterious circumstances, sometimes claimed to have died after being strangled by the ghosts of his former patients. This story has been repeated so often across television specials and websites that many assume it to be established fact. The historical record tells a different, more sobering story. There is no verified documentation confirming the existence of this specific doctor, his alleged experiments, or his dramatic death. No contemporary hospital records, death certificates, or Italian medical archives have surfaced to substantiate the tale in the specific and gruesome form in which it usually circulates. This does not mean that psychiatric care in the early 20th century was gentle or free of the disturbing practices common to the era. Lobotomies and other now discredited treatments were indeed used in psychiatric institutions across Europe and the United States during this period, and conditions in many asylums, including likely at Poveglia, were often harsh by modern standards, reflecting the limited understanding of mental illness at the time. But the specific cinematic story of the murderous doctor and his tower fall appears to be a piece of modern folklore, likely constructed and popularized well after the hospital's closure, rather than a documented historical event. If this distinction between verified history and popular legend is the kind of nuance you appreciate, let us know in the comments which part of Poveglia's story surprised you most, because the deeper we go, the more the line between fact and fear becomes genuinely difficult to trace, and that tension is precisely what makes this island's history so compelling. What is documented through architectural surveys and photographs taken by researchers who accessed the site legally in more recent decades is the physical decay of the hospital complex itself. The main building, with its distinctive bell tower, still stands, its walls stained by damp and neglect, its corridors littered with rusted medical equipment, overturned furniture, and the debris of a facility abandoned mid-function rather than carefully decommissioned. Photographs from these surveys show hospital beds still arranged in rows, medical charts left behind, and overgrown courtyards where patients once, according to hospital records, were permitted limited outdoor time. The atmosphere captured in these images, without any embellishment required, is genuinely haunting, simply because of what it documents. An institution where real people lived out difficult chapters of their lives, in isolation, on an island already carrying centuries of association with death. After the hospital's closure in 1968, Poveglia was left largely abandoned. Italian authorities maintained legal ownership, but the island was not actively developed or opened to the public. Access was restricted, partly due to safety concerns regarding the deteriorating structures, and this restriction, combined with the island's already fearsome reputation, only deepened its mystique. Local fishermen, as mentioned earlier, reportedly avoided fishing too close to its shores, a claim repeated in numerous journalistic accounts of the island over the decades, tied to genuine unease about disturbing what many believed to be an island whose very soil contained the ash and bone of plague victims. In 2014, the Italian government auctioned a 99-year lease on Poveglia, offering it to private investors interested in redeveloping the site, potentially as a resort or hotel. This event drew international media attention, precisely because of the island's reputation, and sparked renewed public fascination with its history. Ultimately, the winning bid fell through due to financing difficulties, and Poveglia remained undeveloped, its buildings continuing their slow surrender to time and weather, a monument to centuries of human suffering that no investor, it seemed, was quite prepared to transform into a luxury destination. Why does a piece of land, barely more than 7 hectares in size, continue to command this level of fascination, fear, and reluctance centuries after its worst chapters concluded? Part of the answer lies in the sheer historical weight the island carries, a weight that is unusually well documented compared to many so-called cursed locations around the world. Poveglia is not a place where fear was manufactured from vague rumor alone. It is a place where Venetian government records confirm centuries of quarantine use, where modern soil analysis supports claims of mass burial, and where 20th century medical institution records confirmed decades of psychiatric hospitalization under conditions typical of, and sometimes harsher than, the era's medical standards. Layer upon layer of genuine historical trauma accumulated on this single island, and that accumulation is precisely what distinguishes Poveglia from many legendary locations whose reputations rest primarily on folklore with little archival support. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to suggest that every claim about Poveglia holds up to scrutiny. The island demonstrates something important about how historical trauma transforms into legend over time. A real, documented history of plague quarantine and mass death provided fertile ground for exaggeration. A real, documented history of 20th century psychiatric institutionalization, with all its era-appropriate harshness, provided fertile ground for invented stories of individual cruelty that cannot be substantiated by surviving records. Poveglia, in this sense, offers a rare opportunity to watch the machinery of historical myth-making in action, layered directly on top of verifiable tragic fact. Visiting Poveglia today, for the small number of researchers, journalists, and permitted visitors who have done so, apparently involves navigating overgrown paths between crumbling brick structures, stepping carefully around collapsed sections of flooring in the old hospital building, and standing beneath the bell tower that has become the centerpiece of the island's modern legend, regardless of whether the specific story attached to it can be verified. The lagoon surrounds the island in every direction, calm and shallow, the same waters that once carried plague victims toward isolation, and later carried psychiatric patients toward institutionalization, and today carry almost no one at all. Before we close, it's worth pausing on what makes this story remarkable, not because Poveglia is haunted in any way that can be proven, but because it stands as a physical record of how societies have historically responded to what frightened them most: disease, death, and mental illness, by pushing the sources of that fear to the margins, quite literally, onto an island separated from daily life by open water. If you found this exploration of how documented history and enduring legend intertwine on a single small island valuable, tapping like on this video helps more viewers discover these carefully researched stories. And if you want to see similarly documented explorations of history's most feared locations, subscribing ensures you won't miss what comes next. Poveglia's story does not end with dramatic revelation or definitive answers, and perhaps that absence of resolution is itself the most historically honest conclusion available. The island's plague-era history is confirmed by centuries of Venetian record-keeping. Its role as a psychiatric hospital is confirmed by 20th century Italian institutional records, but the precise emotional and physical suffering experienced by the thousands of individuals who lived, and often died, on this small patch of lagoon, soil remains only partially recoverable, filtered through official documents that rarely captured the personal terror of the people they described. What remains is an island whose ground, according to those who have studied it, holds a greater concentration of human remains than almost any comparable site in Europe, a place where documented history alone, without any need for invented embellishment, explains why boatmen still hesitate, why fishermen still avoid its shallows, and why Poveglia continues to be remembered centuries after its darkest days, as the island history itself seems reluctant to let go.